Okay, let's go ahead and get started, everybody. Welcome to our second professional development for faculty across the state of Kansas. For those of you who are new today, my name is Whitney Turner, and I'm a faculty member at Johnson County Community College's Math Department. In addition, I serve as the co-chair of the Kansas Math Pathways Task Force. That's a mouthful. As many of you know, we are working across the state of Kansas to implement math pathways, co-requisite support, and statewide course placement measures. Since there are so many of us here today, make sure that you keep that computer on mute for right now and put any questions or comments that you have in the chat during the presentations. If we don't have a chance to answer those during the presentation, we will of course take those and answer them afterward and post them like we did the last time. As we begin today, I want to take a moment to frame the work that we are all doing across Kansas right now. Our goal with this Math Pathways initiative is to help students achieve their aspirations. When a student decides what they would like to study, our first job is to help that student find a relevant and rigorous mathematics course that corresponds with their studies. Again, that relevant, rigorous piece is really important there. Once we have that math pathway for our students, we are going to be using standardized placement measures across the state to help determine what level of support that student needs in order to be successful at that math course. So that's how the three pieces all work together. We have the pathway first, and then measures that identify how much support that student needs. It's important to note we can provide different levels of support for different students in that same Gateway Math course. So remember that as you are working on designing your co-requisite supports, is that you could have different levels of support for that same course. Today, our focus is going to be on placement measures and on some history of these math reforms. The goals are to review policy and hear from colleagues about the why and how these math reforms came to be. We're going to have some breakout rooms just like we did last time after our presentations in order for you to connect with your colleagues across the state. Okay, so we are joined today by Dr. Jennifer Bonsracki from the Kansas Board of Regents Academic Affairs Department. She's going to be discussing with us policy review and institutional decisions in regards to the placement measures.
Thanks so much, Whitney, and it's wonderful to be here with everyone today. As Whitney indicated, my presentation today will be on multiple measures placement decisions, and I will do a similar presentation with the executive implementation teams coming up the end of October. So if you go back and you're chatting with your CAOs and other colleagues and they haven't heard this yet, just due to timing, they'll have a very similar presentation coming up in the month of October. They've received the content of this via an email from our Vice President of Academic Affairs, Rusty Munholland, but they'll have time to explore the institutional decisions together a little bit later. Okay, Whitney, let's go ahead and do the overview slide. So thinking a little bit about my brief presentation with you guys today, we'll start off by reviewing placement into Gateway Math courses historically and within the state of Kansas. Next, I will provide an overview of the multiple placement measures decisions by courses, followed by the limitations of the professional discretion caveat, and concluding with a review of the approval process that led to the decisions. All right, let's get started. So taking a look at course placements. As you guys know, traditionally higher education institutions have relied on standardized tests to place students into Gateway English and Math courses. While these assessments have their place, relying solely on a single test offers a limited evaluation. A more holistic approach uses multiple measures for course placement, such as ACT/SAT scores, completion of a specific high school math course, or achieving a certain high school GPA. This approach has proven to be a better predictor of student success, and it helps reduce unnecessary developmental education placements. always like to add on this slide too, just from my personal experiences, having served as a graduate dean, I've certainly seen firsthand the benefit of holistic approaches and students having the opportunity to document readiness for a variety of academic endeavors, having that holistic approach rather than a reliance on a single test. And as someone who was not a very good standardized test taker, I always appreciated the opportunity to show my abilities in other ways. Okay, let's move forward, Whitney. Within the state of Kansas, we have traditionally relied heavily on standardized assessments and operated under a system where each institution independently determined a student's eligibility to enroll in a gateway math or English course. So this lack of uniformity resulted in up to 22 different standards across the state's higher education institutions. The absence of system-wide readiness standards for college math and English created a missed opportunity to communicate clear expectations to high school teachers, counselors, and students planning for higher education. Next slide. And Whitney, could you go ahead and push enter for me just a few more times? This slide kind of comes up in pieces. Yeah. Thank you, that's perfect. So a system-wide placement committee was first convened in February of 2024. President Flanders attended the initial meeting and charged the committee with developing recommendations for system-wide placement measures for 3 gateway math courses: college algebra, elementary statistics, and contemporary math. So if you're looking at the slide, the number 1 in the blue box, that's what the Math Course Placement Measure Committee was charged with, was developing number 1. The committee met on 7 occasions from February through July to reach consensus on the proposed recommendations. From the slide above, of course, the charge of the committee was to identify the measures to be used across the state and set scores for those measures. And in the upcoming slides, I'm going to present the committee's recommendations, which were approved for placing students into each of those gateway math courses without co-requisite development support. Let's take a look now at college algebra. So as a reminder, per K-Board policy, each student who meets either a system-wide course placement measure or an institutionally designated course placement measure is eligible to enroll in a gateway course without developmental support. Students who do not meet either measure will be placed into the gateway course with developmental support. So this slide presents the committee's recommendations for the scores needed for students to place into college algebra without co-requisite developmental support. Students need only demonstrate readiness by achieving one of these scores. I would also like to draw your attention to the option for institutional measures and professional discretion. Policy states that an institutionally designed course placement measure could include, but are not limited to, vendor-based assessments, homegrown assessments, or an evaluation of non-cognitive factors, such as motivation and workplace experience. These measures are approved at the institutional level and only apply in cases in which the student does not meet any of the applicable system-wide course placement measures. This category also provides institutions the professional discretion to place students in the gateway course by considering scores on multiple measures as well as non-cognitive factors known to the institution. Now let's move on and take a look at contemporary math and elementary statistics. These are the scores needed for students to place into these 2 courses without co-requisite developmental support. Students need only demonstrate readiness by achieving one of these scores, the same as it was for college algebra. I would like to briefly explain why the committee recommended different scores for college algebra compared to these 2 gateway math courses. Committee members with expertise in math noted that many assessments are designed to measure readiness for college algebra rather than the skills needed for contemporary math and stats. Therefore, the different scores do not reflect the rigor of the courses, but rather the specific skills the assessments are intended to measure. Now, let's dig a little bit deeper into what we mean by professional discretion. So if we look at, yeah, that was right, Whitney, thank you. You were reading my mind. If we look at evidence-based discretion, professional discretion, there are limitations. So it should be noted that institutions can use professional discretion when searching for evidence of a student's ability to complete the gateway course without co-requisite support. However, discretion does not allow institutions to first eliminate or disregard an approved statewide measure. So in other words, if, for example, your institution does not currently take an SAT math score now, you would be required to do so moving forward. So the student could demonstrate readiness, and the institutions would have to accept all of those scores that were, or all of those measures that were previously shared. And the second limitation is that an institution can not prevent enrollment in a gateway course if that score is met. So I like to view this as an institution can search for reasons to bump a student up into the gateway course without co-requisite support, but you're not permitted to bump a student down if they have met those statewide assessment scores set by this committee. Next slide. I want to briefly review the approval process that was used to reach these decisions. Recommendations for multiple placement measures were approved by BASC in September, and CAOs have been notified of the decisions. Just last week, we also added a subpage on the KBOR website outlining the placement measures decisions, as well as the specific report that the BASC members read before they approved these recommendations. I want to spend a moment at the campuses. So right now, the decisions are with the campuses, and this would be the ideal time for campuses to engage in any approval process that should occur. So for example, some institutions have prereq or co-requisites for enrolling into gateway courses, and that's not to be confused with co-requisite or prerequisite developmental support, right? But your pre or co-reqs for enrolling in a course. These now need to be updated to align with the approved system-wide if they contradict them in any way. And I'll speak with the CAOs coming up about the ability to use an expedited approval process if they think that that is warranted and welcomed on their campus. All of these approvals need to be in place to ensure alignment with these system-wide decisions by fall of 2025. And as I mentioned, we'll be speaking with CAOs regarding the option for an expedited review process for any changes that you need to make to those pre and co-reqs. The Placement Measures Committee also offered implementation considerations, which are being utilized in various ways. For example, we're collaborating with adult education, that division at KBOR, to support institutions in helping students who are not ready for gateway math courses with co-requisite developmental support. Additionally, we are using the recommendations to share ideas and consideration of complex integration issues that will hopefully save institutions time and facilitate the sharing of best practices. For example, the committee made recommendations on the longevity for test measures, and I'll discuss that on the next slide. So let's go ahead and move there now. All institutions are required per KBOR policy to implement the approved placement measures by fall 2025. However, there are several options for institutions to customize how these measures are implemented. So I just want to share a few. Institutions have the authority to choose to use self-reported data by students. National research shows that students tend to report this information accurately, and in Kansas, we do have English departments already using self-reported data to place students into courses with great success. KBOR also encourages institutions to allow for this self-reported grades for placement purposes. Institutions can also determine how long placement scores remain valid. The Placement Measures Committee has recommended the following guidelines. For math, ACT, SAT scores, AccuPlacer, and ALEX PPL, the committee recommends 3 years. For high school GPA and course grade, the committee recommends 2 years. Finally, some institutions may require students to meet with advisors to discuss placement into gateway math courses, while others may allow students to self-enroll without advisor approval. Okay, Whitney, if we have time, I'm happy to take a few questions.
I think we have a little bit of time. Do you mind, though, before we take questions, if I talk a little bit about
Oh,
those
right. Sorry.
potential floor scores, if that's okay?
Yes, of course. Apologies. Yep.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that review on policy and information. As I said, I want to take a couple of minutes here and talk about the idea of a floor score for college algebra co-requisite support. The Placement Measures Committee was particularly concerned about students who place low in all of the placement categories and recognizing that some students may lack the foundational algebraic skills for success in a co-requisite course. With this in mind, the committee agreed to establish recommended scores to help identify these students. And I'm probably going to repeat myself a couple of times here, but I want to make sure that I'm covering all my bases with these. The Placement Measures Committee convened on September 11th and the 19th of this month to recommend the lower bounds for placing student into college algebra with co-requisite support. So we're not actually sharing the scores that they recommended at this time because the recommendation wording has not been finalized or approved by the Placement Measures Committee. So we will update you as soon as that goes through. But we wanted to at least talk to you about this now so that you had it in your mind for later. It's important to emphasize that these scores are intended as guidelines for additional support and should not be used as a mandatory cut score for developmental intervention. Per policy, no college or university may bar a student from enrolling in their Gateway math course with co-requisite support. Additionally, these minimum scores are not intended to direct students into traditional prerequisite developmental courses. Institutions are encouraged to consider additional interventions for students who do not meet these recommended scores for college algebra with co-requisite support. However, the decision to pursue developmental intervention ultimately rests with the student. These scores are just recommendations and may be adjusted by colleges and universities at their professional discretion. So these were scores that the committee came up with as just potential scores that may apply to students. But of course, if your institution has a different measure that they prefer or a different number on this, that is okay. These are recommendations. So again, these scores are not intended to send students to a different pathway or traditional prerequisite support. These scores are to help identify the students who may require additional supports. So it is very much up to institutional discretion on this. So now we want to open the floor to questions at this time. Are there any questions or anything during these presentations that you'd like to discuss?
I have a quick question, and sorry, I was trying to multitask and I missed some pieces here. But the requirements for fall 25, what is that again, above having one section of each gateway course with co-requisite? What else? What did you mention, Jen?
Yeah, great question, Sarah. Implementing the placement measure decisions. Yeah. And just so you guys know, in the email that was sent out from VP Munholland to the CAOs, in addition to outlining those system-wide approved scores, it also indicated that those would go into place for fall of 25. Where you can, right? Based on the courses that you're offering.
Are there any other questions about the placement measures?
I did have a question. I was wondering, it was like intervention with adult education. How would we be able to like recommend if the student was looking for the additional support, how would we be able to send them to adult education that's not involved at our university?
Yeah, Stephanie, I will say we'll offer more information on that to come. Right now, the Adult Education Division at KBOR is taking time to review information from the placement measures group thus far and the information that's forthcoming. And so they will let us know what services they might be able to provide and how you would go about referring a student to those services if you don't currently offer them on your campus. So great question, and definitely more to come about that.
Okay, thanks.
Kathy, I see your question in the chat. I'm not sure I quite understand it. So we cannot say a student isn't college ready and direct. I'm not sure. Do you mind coming on and explaining your question? I think I'm not reading it correctly. I'm not hearing it. Okay, so we cannot tell a student to not enroll in a gateway course with co-requisite support. We can offer additional advising where there may be some additional support out there for that student, but we can't prevent them from registering for a course with co-requisite support. So hopefully that answers the question there.
And I'll just extend this, although I don't think our question related to this, but a nice reminder, we also can't prevent students from enrolling in the Gateway course without co-requisite support if they meet any of the established system-wide measures.
So if there is a course that doesn't have their co-requisite and they haven't met the guidelines, we don't have to enroll them in that. We only have to enroll them if it has a co-requisite with it, whether or not they've met any requirements, correct?
Let me see if I'm understanding what you're asking. So all of our gateway courses will have a co-requisite course or co-requisite support model somehow related to them. So with our placement measures, a student can either get into the gateway course using those measures, or they go into a gateway course with co-requisite support. So each of our gateway courses have some supplemental co-requisite support that's offered with them. That's part of the policy. Jennifer, did that answer the question?
So basically, like, we have college algebra, then you're saying that we'll have to also have college algebra with co-requisite support offered. And same thing with stats. There's going to be a regular stats and the stats with co-requisite support. There's going to be contemporary math and contemporary math with co-requisite support. And so we can't, so if they don't meet the guidelines for some other reason, they can't just take the regular stats or college algebra or contemporary math, and they have to take, then we can't keep them out of the one with the co-requisite support.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yep. I just want to offer one clarification. You can have the co-requisite developmental support section that involves students from all of the 3 Gateway math courses. We do not recommend it. It is not best policy, but we've been talking about, as you guys implement this, you'll need to take a developmental approach and you can't do everything all at once. So if you need to only have one co-requisite developmental support section as you do your soft launch in fall of 25, instead of one for each of the Gateway courses, we certainly do understand that. But again, not best policy. As you can imagine, the content for each of those co-req support sections will be very different depending on the nature of the course.
And I just need to circle back for my own clarity here. So let's say for our quantitative reasoning, we currently are offering co-requisite support, but we have different placement measures than what have been set by the Math Pathways Placement Group. So in fall 25, if we're running our quantitative reasoning with co-requisite support, they need to have the placement measures in place that the group approved, right? Not what we have been using. Am I understanding that correct?
What would need to be in place is those scores that were approved by BAS to enroll in the Gateway course without support.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry if I said something to make that ambiguous.
No, you're all good. Thank you.
Okay.
Can you hear me now? I think.
Yes, yeah.
Oh,
Thanks,
gosh,
Kathy.
I had to go out and come back in.
Oh,
I'm
no.
so sorry. I know we need to move on, but just to clarify, we're looking at a whole bunch of stuff as well, to address those students' needs that are at the floor, pretty much the floor score. But if the student is there, can we just direct them to adult ed before we even feed them? I mean, I feel like if we say, okay, you can go ahead and take college algebra with co-rec, we're dooming them for failure and with a 5 credit hour class. So we can't automatically stop them from taking and direct them to adult ed and say they're not college ready. Is that correct or not correct?
You can direct them to adult ed, right, through advising conversations. But I don't think you can prohibit them from enrolling in the Gateway course with co-requisite support. However, I will make a note of that and follow up and confirm that with policy.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I see a question in the chat. For a student whose scores place them into Gateway with co-requisite, what if the student refuses or doesn't want to enroll and wants to take the regular version? So from what I'm reading from that is if a student does not place into the Gateway course on its own, do they have to do the co-requisite support? And I think that's up to professional discretion at that point. There can be individual waivers, but you can't have a policy necessarily that everybody gets into the regular Gateway course. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I would add to that, the only way that you could use the professional discretion caveat is if you have evidence, some sort of data to support that decision, not just because the student is not interested in taking the co-requisite support. You would have to have maybe institutional data that shows that a student with their profile could be successful in the Gateway course or something like that. KBOR will be gathering the data as we move forward on how institutions are using that professional discretion. So we would be able to capture that in future years.
And I think that's related to the question above it as well. If they don't meet the cutoff score for college algebra, they can still enroll in it. So obviously no mandatory placement. So I think that addresses that as well. You can certainly have mandatory placement, and students can't just automatically get into college algebra, contemporary math, or elementary statistics without meeting that criteria.
Correct. They have to meet the criteria. Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
And it's not your last opportunity. If more questions arise as we do our work together, then we'll take them as they come along.
Okay, well then if there are additional questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. But I think we are going to break out into breakout groups now. There's going to be 2 different options for you. There's going to be a college algebra breakout group and then a and then contemporary math / elementary statistics. The reason that we're breaking it up in those 2 is that we have different placement scores for those groups. So the college algebra has one set of placement scores and the other 2 have a different set of placement scores. And the preparation, as we said, is algebraic versus non-algebraic there. So please select the one that you are interested in joining. We know that the measures and co-requisite support could look very different for these courses. So we wanted to give you a chance to talk with your peers about what you're planning on doing. When you go into your groups, please take some time to think and discuss with one another. So our goal is to provide time for you to talk across the state and with your colleagues about what other people are doing. I do have some additional questions for you guys to look at, and I'll put those in the chat right now, just to start the conversation flowing. Just give me 1 second. Here we go. Okay, so there's 3 different possible questions for you guys to start that conversation. Does your school currently use high school GPA as a measure for getting into courses? How did you implement it? Are students self-reporting that information? Do you have additional measures or homegrown assessments that you use to place students? And when you are designing your co-requisite courses, will you have different levels of support for different students? So if there's a student that is just kind of right below that level of going directly into it, do you have one level of support for them? And then for students who require maybe additional support past that, you have a different level of support. So please go ahead and Jennifer, do you mind opening up those groups?
Yes, they are open.
Okay, all right. And then I'm going to go into the college algebra group just to help with discussion. And Jennifer, you'll go into the elementary stats and contemporary math.
Will do. Yep.
And then, yes, we are definitely coming back here after the breakout sessions because we have another wonderful presentation to talk about kind of the history. Welcome back, everyone. That was a really interesting breakout session in the college algebra room. There was a lot of people sharing their fears and worries about the co-requisite model and how to address such a diverse group of students in that co-req model. And I feel like the discussion was just getting started. So hopefully we can continue those discussions as well. How was the contemporary math and statistics room?
Yeah, similarly, I too felt like we were just getting into some good details. There seems to be a real strong interest in maybe some best practices around co-req dev support in general for online. And so we'll see what we can pull together to offer around that, as well as maybe going back to the fact that many institutions are developing the elementary stats course without calculus as the prereq. So what maybe syllabi look like from other institutions who already do that, or final course exams, just to give an example of the type of content that would be covered during the semester.
Interesting. Okay, we want to continue our discussion today with a presentation from Jason Robertson from Johnson County Community College and Dr. Mark Malone from Garden City Community College to discuss the why and how of math reform. All right, Jason and Mark, please take it away. I will share your PowerPoint if that works okay.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, if you guys don't mind taking a second and just giving a little bit of background about yourself, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Jason, do you want a background first? Okay, my name's Mark Malone. I'm currently serving as Vice President for Instructional Services at Garden City Community College. I have been working, my field is English, so I started with a faculty position in English, Department Chair of English. I've been working with co-requisite sort of developmental education reform for about 9 years now, with successful implementations in a different field at 2 different institutions as a faculty member and as an administrator. So I'm happy to talk with you today about adopting a hopeful stance.
My name is Jason Robertson. I'm an assistant professor of math at Johnson County Community College. Math is a second career for me. I was a nurse for 21 years. So I teach a lot of developmental math students. I have for a long time. I taught a lot of them in the high school setting too, in a school district that heavily tracked math students. So that experience has sort of carried over to my community college work. I teach a lot of elementary algebra students, a lot of intermediate algebra students. And sort of what I have done is try to research and inform myself as much as I can. I'm used to environments where things are constantly changing. And so I've just done a lot of my own research to try to understand kind of what some of the how and why is. So that's a little bit about me.
So I think I have the first slide, Whitney, if you want to move to that one. So just a little bit of a preview, because I come from an English background and not a math background, you're going to hear mostly from Jason today, who has spent time compiling research that he has encountered in his doctoral work. Is that right, Jason? I think I got that right. Yes.
That is correct.
So you're going to hear a lot of, first, we're going to talk really briefly kind of about the really overarching mission of higher education and where these reform requests are coming from. these reform requests are happening in a whole bunch of states, so where is it coming from? And then we'll spend most of our time with Jason going through summaries of some scholarly literature that talks about success of these types of initiatives in other places. And then we'll hear briefly from me in a personal experience I had when I was doing this as a faculty member. And then I think, are we heading back into discussion rooms after that? Is that right, Whitney?
Yep.
We'll see if we have time. So if we go to the next slide then. One of the things, and I uncovered this in my own doctoral work in a course on curriculum, but I think it's really fascinating to take a step back and think about where the why of this is. I've been in a role as a faculty member with administrative push to implement developmental education reform. In the breakout session on college algebra, I was taking a few notes on phrases I heard like, why fix something that isn't broken? We're going to lose our students. It's a tragedy. And I promise you, I said every single one of those phrases when we were working on this at Cloud County Community College in English in 2015. So, and one of the big questions that faculty have asked me and I have thought about myself is, where does all of this come from? Why the push? So I think it comes really from this idea that the overarching mission of higher ed is shifting underneath of us. We used to live in a world where, really since World War II, that access was the key. Access, access, access. So in 1944, there was the GI Bill sending tens and tens of thousands of former armed service people into higher education, a population of students that really prior to that moment hadn't had that opportunity. There was a 1947 President's Commission on Higher Education. It was the first time that the federal government really convened a group of people and said, how is higher education doing? And from that 1947 meeting, we get more access things like we should develop community colleges. In 20 years after this, we had 1,200 community colleges popping up around the nation. We also invented things like federal financial aid to help students access education. Again, access. And this was a quote from one of the texts that I read during this doctoral work. Was the idea was to give new and diverse students new and diverse options for higher education. Early leaders and advocates said that these students had the right to fail. Getting them access mattered the most. In the 1980s, we started to see a real big shift from just the notion of access to pushing the idea of completion and equity. And just like when the world was access, we had some large world things happening at the time. The 1980s was a time when we started to have some nationwide anxiety about where the United States lives in terms of the world. So you start to see things like countries in Europe, for the first time, achieving more in math and science, achieving higher scores in math and science than students in the United States. Which is still a trend today. So we start to see this anxiety about where we are in the world and where higher education is and how well higher education is performing. And then we start in it really starts churning in the 1980s. There's a ton of this. In the 2000s, we start getting these large nonprofit organizations like Pew Foundation, Lumina, Ford, Kresge Foundations. They start pumping money in to study higher education and find barriers, looking at huge, massive data sets that people hadn't really looked at or had the power to look at before, and finding barriers and focusing on how do we solve those barriers for completion and equity. And developmental education, this idea of gateway courses and courses leading up to them, has been targeted, as Jason will talk about, in many, many studies, looking at these barriers and finding ways to eliminate them for students. So that's just, again, a picture of the why, where this is all coming from, and it's really coming from a shifting sense of the world around us. So Jason, do you want to take it away and start getting into some of the research?
Sure. Whitney, would you mind going to the next slide? Perfect. So I'll just kind of segue in from what Dr. Malone was talking about. So we have this shift to access, and what the literature is saying now is, even though we're open access, are we really improving access with the large number of students who never complete a degree or never complete a credential. And so it's drilled down and kind of looked at why is that? Why is it that folks aren't completing transfer to a four-year institution or completing an associate's degree or a credential of some sort? And what I read over and over and over again, study after study, and I quoted this study by Barr. Barr is Barr and Go, Koziewicz. Those are names that I see over and over and again as I look at this. It said that one of the key reasons is students become, and these are Barr's words, mired in developmental curricula in math, reading or writing. They never make it to a gatekeeper course. They never make it to a degree or to a transfer program because they don't persist. That initial placement in developmental coursework, and oftentimes students who are placing in developmental mathematics coursework are placing in developmental reading and writing coursework. There's a whole corpus of literature that talks about the relationship between developmental mathematics and developmental reading and writing. And it consistently shows that students who struggle in reading and writing are going to struggle in mathematics. And so students who in their initial placements place in multiple developmental courses, it's just like a big gut punch, and they don't ever really get past that. And go ahead and go to the next slide, Whitney. The other trend that they talk a lot about is while people increasingly, and I would say the last 10, 15 years, are placing into developmental courses, they're not opting to enroll in them because they don't go to college to take a developmental course in their mind. So rather than complete what would be a 3 or 4 course, sometimes sequence in developmental mathematics, they're just opting not to enroll at all in any courses. And there's lots of interesting literature about why that is. And it all comes down to stigmatization, to math phobia. There are a couple of interesting theories that I've run into as I've been trying to think of ways to help my developmental students. One of them is the academic momentum theory, and its name kind of gives itself away. As I mentioned before, when they place into developmental courses, the realization that they're going to have to take an arithmetic class, followed by an elementary algebra class, followed by an intermediate algebra class, none of which are transferable before they get to the college algebra course that they need. They might enroll in that first developmental class. They might do okay in that first developmental class, but research shows us that they're not continuing on because it's just overwhelming and it feels like too big of a hurdle. 3 semesters of math to get to the math course that in their mind matters is just a lot for some of them to overcome. Closely tied to that theory is the assistance hindrance theory, which says that essentially the extra assistance that developmental courses provide students, that's why we're in the business of teaching developmental courses, because we want to assist and we want to shore them up and get them the skills they need to be successful. That assistance hindrance theory says that the opportunity cost of other things foregone is simply greater than the assistance students perceive they're getting out of a developmental sequence, and so they quit. They don't persist through it. So ultimately, the consensus in the literature is that lengthy 3 or 4 course developmental sequences, because they don't fulfill a graduation requirement, they're associated with a large investment in time and money, and students just don't see the value in that, or they're not willing, not all students, but as a general rule, they're not willing to make that investment. And somewhere in the neighborhood, there was a large study done in the state universities of New York that showed about $3 billion was being spent on developmental education without the desired return on investment in terms of students completing a degree or a credential. You can go ahead and move to the next slide, Whitney. And so Barr also goes on to talk about how the efficacy of developmental courses is mixed at best. As someone who's taught a lot of them, there are some good semesters and some semesters that leave you scratching your head. And I'm sure everyone feels that way from time to time. And so efforts to address the problem, kind of as we're looking at how we've gotten to where we are right now, a variety of different things. So there are states and institutions that provide accelerated support courses. So instead of taking 3 or 4 16-week or 8-week courses in the developmental sequence, they've tried to compress those down into 5 or 6 week courses, one 5 or 6 week course. The co-requisite support courses that we've been talking about, curricular pathways, which we're also talking about. And then sort of key behind the scenes with all of that has been a push to broaden determinants of placement. And we talked about that. Why don't we just rely on a single score anymore? Why are we tending to rely on multiple measures? And we talked about the reasons why. Problems with standardized placement exams. Probably the biggest one that emerges in the literature is just lack of studies demonstrating that they have good predictive validity. And what that leads to more often than not according to the literature is underplacement. So we're not having a whole lot of students that are overplacing in courses when we rely on, a standardized cut score. But students are underplacing by as much as 18 to 30%. So you've got students who are being put in courses when they could have succeeded in the next level or the college level course. The literature talks a lot about a lack of systematic approach in establishing cut scores. One school talked about how its math faculty set cut scores, and the math faculty took the placement exam and tried to mimic what they thought a student might miss if they weren't college algebra ready or they weren't intermediate algebra ready. And by mimicking what they thought that student might or might not know, that was how they determined cut scores. Pretty much all of the instruments that are used make a recommendation that the institution should validate what its cut scores are, but we don't see a lot of that validation happening, and it's for a number of different reasons: lack of resources and available funding to do that. Of course, we talked about how it's just a point in time assessment, whereas multiple measures give you a picture across time of what a student's capable of. And as I mentioned before, underplacement tends to be a big problem, and there's all kinds of studies, and they usually employ a research discontinuity design. If you're interested in hearing any more about that, feel free to reach out or ask me about it, but that's typically the design that they're using. We could go ahead and move on, Whitney. So that sort of got us to this point of multiple measures, and consistently research has shown that high school GPA tends to be a strong predictor of performance in college math and English courses. And so too has math achievement. So the second thing that they tend to look at after unweighted high school GPA is what's the highest level math course that the student took, and what grade did they earn in that. You can go ahead and move on. And so along those lines, there was a large study in the California community college system. It had almost 202,000 students that were involved. They were enrolled in developmental or college level classes. And the research questions that it looked at is what measures are useful in predicting students' performance in developmental and college level classes? Do those predictors vary across different subgroups? So by race, socioeconomic status, English proficiency, et cetera. And what are the thresholds? So once we determine what those factors are, how do we set what the thresholds are for placement? The methodology that study used, it did data mining and trending. And so what it did was it ultimately set probabilities of success, and then based on those probabilities of success, made determinations about what courses students were going to be placed in based on some multiple measures. And then looked at, in terms of outcomes, were those students able to achieve grades of C or higher in their initial attempt on that course? The finding was pretty compelling that cumulative high school GPA is a strong predictor of passing math and English courses across all different levels of skill and across all subgroups. And if you flip the slide, you can see the thresholds for placement that they determined. So this is an example. I won't read the whole slide to you, but it gives you an idea of what types of factors were looked at. And what I thought was interesting is that the California study looked at direct matriculants. So they separated out or parsed out the students who went immediately from high school into the community college setting versus the students who took, I believe, 2 to 3 years off. So you can see that their criteria take into account that there's been a gap in time. And so some of the criteria, GPA criteria and prerequisite high school knowledge are a little bit different if they've been out of the picture and not doing math for a little while. And so more recently, I mentioned the Universities of New York, or the SUNY study, was approximately 13,000 students. And they also did the study in conjunction with 4 Minnesota community colleges and a community college in Wisconsin. And they looked at this idea of whether or not multiple measures yield better student outcomes compared to placements that are based exclusively on standardized test scores. And what I thought was cool about this design is that it was a randomized controlled design. So some of the students were randomized to a group that was placed based on multiple measures, and other students were randomized to a group that was placed exclusively based on standardized test score. And in the SUNY branch of this, the multiple measures they looked at high school GPA and years since high school graduation, along with their placement score. And then in Minnesota and Wisconsin, they looked at standardized test performance, high school GPA, and they also looked at non-cognitive factors. So they had instruments that measured student motivation, et cetera. So there is a reference page. Some of it is as recent as 2022 or 2023, but you can take a look at those references and you can access any of this information. You can go ahead and move. Thank you. So the findings from the SUNY and the Wisconsin-Minnesota study said that high school cumulative GPA was the best observable predictor of success in college level courses, and that students who were bumped up by multiple measures were more likely to successfully complete a college level course across all subgroups. So again, across socioeconomic, race, ethnicity, English language proficiency, et cetera. And that initial study tracked students for 1.5 years and looked at what gains had been made in those 1.5 years. And then there was a follow-up study that tracked them for an additional 4 years. And so the findings from the follow-up I thought were interesting. It said that the higher rates of enrollment in college level math coursework, so more students were getting placed into college math coursework, and they were completing it successfully, but it said the gains were not statistically significant past the first term. So this speaks to the persistence piece of things. I'll talk a little bit about that here in just a second. We saw that higher rates of college level credits were attempted and earned, and that there were higher rates of credential attainment and or transfer to a four-year institution. So again, I want to emphasize, in the spirit of transparency, that all of those were found to be short-term. So what happens over the longer term? You could go ahead and advance the slide. Texas sort of took a look at that. Texas had a large study involving close to 90,000 students. And Texas, the study that was done in Texas, hypothesized that they felt like it might have something to do. They were using a co-requisite model at the time. And so they felt like it might have something to do with what was included in the co-requisite. And so they sort of randomized students to one of two different co-requisite models. The first co-requisite model was a model in which the student was placed in the college level class alongside an accelerated co-requisite that included, like, for example, what would be covered in an elementary algebra or an intermediate algebra class alongside a college algebra class. So that was one potential option for the co-requisite. The second option for the co-requisite was putting students in a co-requisite that addressed study skills, how to read and decode math language, how to use Wicker strategies to mark up a word problem, etc. And so the findings from that study said that students who completed the accelerated co-requisite, so students who completed the elementary algebra and intermediate algebra course sort of bundled together alongside the college algebra course, were 12% more likely to pass the developmental course and 2% more likely to pass the college level math course. But there was really not a whole lot of effect on persistence beyond passing that initial college level class. Interestingly, the students who, hang on just a second, I can't see there. Sorry about that. Students who completed the study skills co-requisite course, they were 1% more likely to complete the college level course, but we're 4% more likely to persist. So it kind of implies that there might be something to, when you look at student persistence, there might be something to what's included in that co-requisite class. Is it generalizable? Is it portable? Is it something that can help them be successful down the road, not only in their mathematics courses, but also in other courses? So, you know, something to think about as you're looking at what's going to go into your co-requisite course to support your students.
So I think there's some good questions happening in the chat, and I'll talk briefly about just the personal story. I mentioned that I've been a part of co-requisite reform in English at 2 different institutions, one of them as a faculty member, and that was at Cloud County Community College. And at that time, we had a new tutoring center coordinator who came in with a lot of this sort of knowledge and research on board, and was really pushing us to reform our developmental education. At that time, we had a 5-credit-hour course focused on sentences. And then after that, students could enter a 3-credit-hour course focused on paragraphs. And then they were deemed ready. If they passed those, they were ready for college algebra, or sorry, not college algebra, composition 1, where they integrated everything they'd learned into essay writing. So I remember very clearly to every single member of the English department at the time, we pushed back hard on this, and we had all of the same questions and concerns that I've heard expressed in the breakout room today. I was a firm advocate of this stance that we would be setting students up to fail, that they of the belief that if students can't do C, or sorry, if they can't do A and B, then they certainly aren't ready for C. So if the gateway course is at this level of C level skills, then we need to get them through A first and then B first. This idea of scaffolding students up. And that was my professional judgment based on my experience inside the classroom. We were tasked with implementing reforms. So we took time to research and figure out what had worked at other institutions. We implemented something because we were asked to, not because we chose to, and not because our professional judgment said we should. So we implemented co-requisite support at scale in fall of 2015. And in the fall of 15 and spring of 16, if you had approached any member of the English department on our hallway and said, "How is that going?" we would have said, "It's terrible, it's awful, we're harming students." We developed the phrase actively harming students. It felt awful. It felt like we were hurting students. It wasn't until we started getting data after that first year that we realized that it actually had been very, very successful. So I'll give you a snapshot of the data. Our pass rate increased 24%. So our Comp 1 gateway course pass rate increased 24%. The attrition rate was really the thing that stood out to me. 42% of our students in that developmental pathway never made it to Comp 1. And I think that's backed up in some of the data that Jason has shared from the same type of studies in the math world, that 42% of our students never made it to Comp 1, which also means they were never making it to a degree. When those students passed Comp 1, we looked at how well they did in Comp 2, and they passed, so the next level course. So does this co-requisite model prepare them for the course after the gateway course? 79% of them passed that gateway, or sorry, the Comp 2 course. We've just gotten some data at what we've done here at Garden City Community College in 2022. So there was a question in the chat about, can this be successful in a post-COVID world? Garden implemented this at scale starting in fall of 22. And the same thing, the attrition rate of students who never made it to Comp 1 dropped from 56% to 0. And the success rate of students in that course was 73.5%. 73.5% of them made it through the gateway course with co-requisite support. And the thing that really was shocking to me, if we looked at 5 years of data prior to implementation of co-requisite and 5 years of data after, 104 0.77 students made it through that gateway course that would not have made it through under the previous model. So these are just stories of success, but I think that I recognize we're talking about two separate fields here, but the mindset of we're setting students up to fail. They can't possibly do paragraphs if they can't yet do sentences. They can't possibly do essays if they can't yet do paragraphs. That mindset is very much something that we have to wrestle with and grapple with. So the story I've told, I think the point is that as a faculty member who worked with students, my professional judgment was wrong. My gut instinct was wrong. My instincts that students could not do C before they could do A and B was wrong. And my instinct to not let students try because they might fail was also wrong. And so I hope that on the whole today, the presentation has given you some reason to hope. There is no getting around the fact that implementing is like there are real challenges in implementing this all at once across the system at the 2 and 4 year levels. I'm just seeing questions pop up in the chat, but there is reason for hope, right? There is reason that to see in both the studies that are scholarly and peer reviewed and large scale and in personal experiences in other fields, there is reason to hope. And just a couple questions in the chat because I think we're basically done here. But with the presentation, if the data is valid, why did it feel like you were harming students? As we were living through the process of doing it for the first time, it was different. It was challenging. It felt not comfortable, right? It was all new. We were learning on the go, and so it did not feel good. It felt like we were harming students. After we learned the data, we could take a step back and look at the entire forest and not just the individual trees. We learned that it had actually been very successful. And I know that there's the instinct to respond to Sandy's question that we're talking about two different fields, and so it can't be possible, it's different. But if we're talking about the notion that they can't possibly write a paragraph before they can write a sentence successfully. And so we must learn all the ways that sentences work before they can successfully do a paragraph. It is very much that same concept of we must lead them slowly through a slowly scaffold thing, as opposed to just-in-time interventions. Whitney.
Yes. Jason, did you want to say anything about the references here or?
Just the big study that talked about post-secondary readiness and the randomized trial that was published in 2023. So that did a lot of these studies. There were a couple of them that were longitudinal that caught pieces of pre, during, and post-COVID in answer to that question. And the only other thing I would just add to Dr. Malone's personal account is I've taught elementary statistics and a quantitative literacy class in both a non-co-requisite and a co-requisite model. And the first time I did it, kind of what my co-requisite looked like, I was given, the courses were either 3 credit hours or 4 credit hours, 4 credit hours if it was a co-rec. So I got 1 credit hour of co-rec time. And kind of what I did, what I found when I worked with students in elementary statistics and in the quantitative literacy class is that there were lots of English language literacy issues. And so we spent a lot of time in the co-rec learning how to read, identify keywords that would help lead us to what the question was asking us for. And then if we were getting ready to do something like unit conversions in the quantitative literacy class, that was a great opportunity to review fractions. If we were getting ready to do some linear modeling, that was a great opportunity to review what slope-intercept form of the line was. And I kept just informal data for my own self to know the difference. And really there wasn't a whole lot of difference I felt between student motivation and ability level in those two classes. It had to do with how they had performed on a standardized test score. And there were differences in their outcomes the students who took the co-requisite version of quantitative literacy, the mean GPA of the students, or the mean grade in that class, was a 2.6 on a scale from 0 to 4 versus a 2.2 for students who didn't take the co-req. So I do think that gains can be made, and it doesn't always feel that way while you're in it, but it certainly can happen.
I'd like to just add a comment, because I see Brooke coming in here a couple times in the chat, and she's using a phrase, just-in-time interventions. And I think that's a really great term because A, that is very descriptive of what a co-requisite model is. And B, it's a really great term for Googling, right? If you want to start Googling, what are teaching strategies to do this? So in the world of English, when we're trying to get students to express complex and articulate thoughts across an essay, sustaining for 5+ pages, if we, every group of students is different. And so in that world, if we are recognizing, oh, these students are struggling with commas, then it's that just-in-time intervention of, we're going to, in that co-requisite support time, we're going to really drill into basic comma usage, right? These types of things that help express clear and articulate thoughts. We're going to focus in on the micro skills that are important just in time, as the students need it, as it comes up. So when in the math world, when you encounter students who don't know how to do addition and subtraction with negatives, we're going to focus in on that particular micro skill, and we're going to hone in on that until students feel better with it. Then they can apply that back to the world of college algebra. The other thing I want to say is, and I'm seeing some positive comments in the chats, that students will rise to the occasion. Most students, not all, but many will. And I think the point of the presentation is there are real challenges with implementation, and it will not be perfect in the first iteration of it, right? We'll need to look at more data and continue to refine what you all implement at your institutions. But the important message of today is to acknowledge those real challenges while also holding space in the back of your head that there are studies indicating lots of success. You've heard from me about success. It is possible. There is reason to hope. So I appreciate you all sitting through that presentation. And I would encourage you really to go look at more studies, look at some things, try and find information. Google just-in-time, math interventions for college algebra, see what comes up. And thank you.
Okay, thank you guys so much for that presentation and just the information and discussion of the studies. We are going to take a chance now to break out into groups again and discuss the presentation, and then specifically what are our fears when we go into the new models with pathways, co-requisites, multiple measures, all of those types of things. Our goal is to talk through some of these things, and we are going to have 2 different breakout rooms assigned randomly. And Jason will go into one of them, and Mark will go into another one. So we'll have a split up again of our presenters there. All right, welcome back. We had some very interesting discussions going on, a little bit of fears discussed, and hopefully a little bit of addressing happening. How was the other breakout room?
Yeah, really great. We also talked about, in addition to fears, how maybe we can use graduate students in the work, as well as how we might use online options to provide the just-in-time support.
Great. Okay, let's finish up our meeting today because we are running a little bit low on time here. I put 2 different pieces in the chat. One was the website to the professional development for the rest of the semester, as well as the Math Pathways Facts page. Both of them are going to be very useful. The Facts page has a ton of those questions that you might be looking, sorry, there was something in the chat that came out. Sorry. There was the Math Pathways Facts address a lot of those general questions that you may have. If you have specific questions beyond that, please reach out to Dr. Jennifer Bonzraki or and I can pass it on to the appropriate person. It looks like there is another professional development on October 18th. The agenda for that is still waiting to be finalized, but as soon as we have it finalized, we'll post the agenda up there. Jennifer, did you have any other announcements that you'd like to give before we go?
Not at this time. Thank you to everyone who attended today.
Yeah. And I know that Dr. Connie Richardson had a couple of things that she wanted to say in regards to some of the questions that were in the chat. Do you think that we have time now, or should we address them in after the fact in like the question and answer page that we post for this?
Maybe we could set some time aside for next time. Yeah, instead of trying to rush when people have plans. So.
Fair enough. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Please register for October 18th, and we will see everybody then.